Rain pelted the cobbled streets of London as whispers spread like wildfire through the alleyways, and drawing rooms alike, a decision was coming, one that would change everything. The year was 1831, and for centuries, power had belonged only to a select few, those who held land titles, wealth, and most of all, control. But on this murky gray morning, the old guard trembled as news reached Parliament. The people were not waiting anymore. Thomas Arkwright, a humble clerk in Whitechapel, had never imagined himself at the center of England's most powerful transformation, yet fate had other plans. As he walked through the crowd near Westminster, he felt the weight of frustration swelling around him. The air crackled with unrest, shouts of injustice rang from every corner. Taxation without representation, rotten boroughs, pocket seats where lords elected friends with barely 10 voters. It was all finally reaching its boiling point. Inside the halls of power, MPs debated with clenched jaws and bloodshot eyes. Lord Grey, a man known for his cold calculation, stood defiant in front of the assembly, demanding one thing: reform. The walls shook, not from the thunder outside, but from the roars of opposition. "This is an insult to tradition," thundered Lord Ashley. "We will not surrender to mobs." The Prime Minister, however, stood his ground, not for power, not for legacy, but because the nation stood on a cliff. The political system had long favored rural elites, leaving rising industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds with little or no representation. The voice of the working class, the voice of emerging middle-class merchants and thinkers, had been silenced too long. Riots had already broken out in Bristol, Nottingham, and Derby. Soldiers had clashed with citizens, streets stained red with desperation. Parliament could not ignore it anymore. Meanwhile, in a small candle-lit tavern beneath the arches of Clerkenwell, an underground meeting pulsed with energy. Dozens of working men had gathered, led by an unshakable voice. Mary Howells, a widow who had lost her husband in a factory fire due to unsafe conditions, stood on a crate and addressed the crowd. "They think we are nothing, but we make this country breathe and bleed and move. They call it progress, but we see no future until we are heard." They nodded raised fists and promised to march the next day. Back at Westminster, Lord Grey pushed the bill for the third time. The first two attempts had failed, sending the country into deeper unrest. King William IV hesitated, knowing that approving the reform bill could split his allies, but denying it might break the kingdom itself. It was not just political anymore, it was survival. As he stared out the palace window, watching thousands gather with torches and banners, the monarch realized time had run out. When morning came, a crowd of over 30,000 citizens gathered outside Parliament Square, chanting liberty and representation now. Inside, Thomas found himself watching from a narrow gallery, clutching a folded leaflet that read, "Justice for All." The debate raged for hours, but then came the vote. The chamber fell silent. Each name called echoed like thunder in the chamber. Ayes to the right, noes to the left, hearts pounded, and breaths were held. At the stroke of midnight, the tally was complete. By a razor-thin margin, the reform bill passed. The crowd outside waited in silence before an echo spread down the line like a wave. "Reform has passed. Reform has passed." And then came the eruption, shouts of joy, tears of relief, people collapsing in one another, arms. It was not the end of struggle, but it was the beginning of something new. The celebrations lit the streets of London like wildfire, yet within the chambers of Parliament a storm continued to brew, for, while the bill had passed, the question remained: what now? The Great Reform Act was a start, but not a conclusion. It had broken centuries of silence, granting new voices a chance to speak, but the system had only shifted slightly, not transformed entirely. Thomas Arkwright stepped outside into the glow of lanterns and bonfires, unsure if the world had truly changed. Back in Clerkenwell, Mary Howells stood before a gathering of exhausted workers, their eyes wet from emotion, but their backs still bent with burden. She spoke not with triumph, but with clarity. We have cracked the door open, but they will try to close it again. Reform is not a gift. It is a right, and rights must be defended together always. Her words rippled across the crowd like a vow in unison. They pledged to keep organizing not just for the vote, but for labor protections, safety, and education. Meanwhile, within royal walls, King William IV wrestled with the consequences of what he had endorsed. The aristocracy fumed, calling the bill a betrayal, claiming the monarchy had knelt to the mob. But the king had seen what unchecked stubbornness looked like. Revolution was not an idea. It was a shadow lurking behind every closed gate and barred window. Reform, he reasoned, was the only antidote to chaos. Still, many of his advisers plotted to undo what had been done, urging legal challenges and whispering fears of anarchy. In the months that followed, the country slowly adjusted to the new electoral landscape. Boroughs like Manchester, Leeds, and Birmingham finally received representation. Citizens who had never dreamed of voting now gathered in chapels and factories, discussing policies, debating future laws, and organizing around issues that affected their daily lives. It was imperfect but powerful, and with every ballot cast a new voice echoed through the halls of government. A voice that had once been invisible, but reform came with consequences. The old powers did not yield quietly. In one chilling instance, a group of noblemen in Dorset plotted to suppress voter registrations among tenant farmers, using threats of eviction as leverage. It was in this climate of resistance that Thomas found his true calling, not just as a clerk, but as a reporter for a newly formed publication, The Common Voice. He wrote of injustice, of voter suppression, and of the growing discontent among those who had been promised change, yet found only resistance. Mary, too, took her fight beyond speeches, founding a union for textile workers in the Midlands, where children toiled for 12 hours a day beneath machines that could maim or kill. She traveled from town to town, sleeping on wooden floors, and speaking to women who had never dreamed their stories mattered. She reminded them, "You are not just laborers, you are citizens now, and your voices count." Her courage inspired thousands, especially young girls who had grown up in silence. By 1833, the winds of reform reached Ireland and Scotland, where demands for fair representation surged. The Reform Act had awakened a hunger for democracy that refused to fade. Each step forward, though small, carved a path towards modern citizenship, toward a Britain that saw governance not as inheritance, but as accountability. It was a fragile path, one marked with setbacks and betrayals, but the first stones had been laid. At Westminster, politicians debated the next steps, some pushing for further reform, others clinging to the remnants of old order. Lord Grey, having fulfilled the mission, he began resigned not in defeat but in purpose. He knew the fight belonged now to others, to the citizens who had marched, shouted, and voted for the first time. As he walked down the stone steps of Parliament, for the final time he looked back only once, nodding at the building where democracy had taken its first breath. Years later, Thomas stood in a modest schoolhouse in Manchester reading aloud to a room of curious children. The story of the Great Reform Act was no longer just ink on a page. It was their inheritance. He spoke of courage, of debate, of Mary, and the marchers of kings who feared, and clerks who wrote of fire and paper and voices that broke walls. The children listened wide-eyed, unaware that their very ability to sit in that room came from those battles. As for Mary, she grew older, her hair graying and her hands wrinkled from years of writing and weaving, but her spirit remained unshaken. On her final public speech, given in a rain-soaked alleyway in Birmingham, she stood beneath a flickering gas lamp and declared, "We were once shadows. Now we are a storm that writes laws, walks into courtrooms, sits at the table, and demands a future, not just for some, but for all." The Great Reform Act was not a perfect law, nor did it bring instant equality, but it was the beginning of something unstoppable. It signaled a shift in what it meant to be English, to be ruled and to rule. It turned whispers into movements, ink into action, and hope into policy. It taught a nation that power could be shared, that representation could grow, and that democracy once awakened could not be silenced again. Thus ended the first chapter in the story of modern British democracy. Not with a revolution, but with a vote. Not with swords, but with voices. And that is how a nation began to change forever.